Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to analyze our soil samples to determine exactly what kind of soil we have. So you're going to need a ruler, and you don't need a permanent marker, but it does help. So first, I took my permanent marker and I drew a little line where each layer of the soil ends. So this makes it just a little bit easier to take your measurements. So then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure how big each of those segments are. Let's zoom in. So let's take a closer look here. So I have my soil sample and I've drawn a line where each layer is, and now I'm going to take my ruler and measure those. I'm going to use centimeters or millimeters because metric is the language of science. So in science we always use metric, not inches. So I'm going to use millimeters for mine because my layers are really small. So I'm going to hold my ruler next to my jar, and here's where those permanent marker lines come in really handy. That makes it really easy to measure. So I'm going to measure up to each one of my lines. I see that my sand layer is 1.7 centimeters. So I'm going to record that on my sheet of paper. Next, I see that my silt layer is only about a millimeter. So I'm going to record that on my paper. And then my clay layer is about 2 millimeters. So I'm going to record that on my paper as well. Then I'm going to do a little bit of math to figure out what proportion of my total sample is sand, silt, and clay.
Okay, now it's time for me to do a little bit of math. Just as a reminder, here were my measurements. I had 1.7 centimeters of sand, 1 millimeter of silt, and 2 millimeters of clay. Now, if you'll notice, some of my measurements are in millimeters, but one of my measurements is in centimeters. So I can't really compare those unless they're in the same unit. So I need to convert my sand into centimeters. Remember that there are 10 millimeters in 1 centimeter. So my 1.7 centimeters becomes 17 millimeters. In order to figure out what percentage of my sample were each of these measurements, sand, silt, and clay, I'm going to use this equation. I'm going to take the height of the layer of soil divided by the total height of the soil. And I'm going to multiply that times 100. And that gives me my percent of each layer of soil. You'll notice that I don't have my total height listed, but I can easily figure that out by adding up all of my measurements. So 17 millimeters plus 1 millimeter plus 2 millimeters is 20 millimeters. So my total height is 20 millimeters. So I'm going to plug these numbers into my equation to get what percent each layer is of the total. So I'm going to start with sand. Remember that my sand was 17 millimeters. I'm going to take 17 millimeters, that's the height of my soil layer, divided by the total height, which was 20 millimeters, times 100. So 17 divided by 20, that gives me 0.85 times 100 is 85%. So my soil sample is 85% sand. Now my silt. My silt was only 1 millimeter. So I'm going to take 1 millimeter divided by my total of 20 millimeters times 100. 1 divided by 20 is 0.05 times 100 gives me 5%. So my soil sample is 5% silt. And now time for my clay, which was 2 millimeters. So I'm going to take 2 millimeters divided by my total of 20 millimeters times 100. 2 divided by 20 is 0.1 times 100 is 10%. So my sample is 10% clay. So now I'm going to take these measurements and use this graph to figure out what kind of soil I have. So remember, mine is 85% sand, 5% silt, and 10% clay. So you see on all 3 sides of this triangle here, we have our soil layers labeled. And this is a little bit different than a regular graph because instead of only plotting from 2 axes, we have 3 axes to plot from. But you'll notice there are some very light colored lines in the background. Those are going to help guide you in what direction you're moving your finger in order to find the point. Okay, so I'm going to start with clay over here. So my clay is 10%, so that is right here. And my silt is 5%. Silt is over here, so my 5% is going to be about right here. And then my sand is 85%. So 85% is going to be right here. Okay, so I'm going to follow these lines. So my clay line is going to go horizontal. I'm going to start at the 10 and drag this over. Okay. Then my silt line is going to come down diagonally like this. Okay, and then my sand line is going to go up diagonally like this. So you see I'm kind of following those light gray lines in the background. And the point at which they merge is right here on loamy sand. So my soil type is loamy sand. And that makes sense because the majority of my sample was sand. So it makes sense that my soil type would be one of the very sandy types of soil. So now try this with your soil. What do you have? Do you have mostly clay? Do you have mostly sand like I do? Or do you have one of the nice loams that are right in the middle with a nice mixture of all 3 soil types?